Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Enonic webinar for developers. My name is Alan. I'm an engineering manager in Enonic. And right now, our experienced software engineer, Espen Norderud, will present a new starter built upon Next.js framework, which we are also planning to release very soon. Welcome, Espen.
Thank you.
The stage is yours.
Welcome, everyone. I'm here to talk about a way to use Next.js together with Enonic XP. And that is XP as a backend and Next.js as a rendering frontend. And I've been told I'm on a tight schedule, so I won't have time to go much into detail. There's going to be some of the code that runs everything we're not going to have time to dig into. But we will, of course, release a thorough guide about this. And for anyone who is not familiar with XP or Next, we have a guide for XP. And of course, Next is very well documented as well. So if anything is unclear, of course, I'll be happy to answer your questions in the chat after the talk. So beyond that, I'll just focus on the general concept and how it can be used by developers to expand the starter. So just so you're prepared and know what's going on, I'll be using Git to make my jumps in code. That's just to save some typing time and lower the risk of mistakes and so on. So I'll show you the differences that are made in each step. So just so you know. Okay. I'll get right into it. The concept here is this. To have two servers running. One front-end server running Next.js, which does the actual rendering, and one back-end server. And those have config that point them to each other. So you can set them up every way you want. Both of them can run on regular projects. You can run on a regular Next project and any XP app that provides a Guillotine GraphQL API. And so this whole project I'm going to tell you about is kind of the boilerplate code that builds on top of this, on top of any project, which will allow a setup like this to run. So the idea is that the request to the Next browser will have a path. And the Next browser will turn that into a query, contact the API Guillotine, and get some content data. And that's done by matching the path. So the URL here needs to have a path that matches the content path of a content item in XP. And devs can add their own queries for GraphQL specialized for certain cases, which we're going to get into, and also add their own React components, which will render on those certain cases. And the fetched data from XP will be used as props for the React rendering. And I'm also going to show you a little thing about the rules for when to use which query and which React component, etc., which we've chosen to call selectors. So let's start with a regular XP site. I'm here in Content Studio. We have the content items in a tree, the way you might be used to seeing it. Here we have some folders. We have a persons folder with person type items in it. And we have a movies folder with movie types items. So that's the important concept here is, first of all, that each item has a content type of its own, and also that their position in the hierarchy defines a URL. So Brad Pitt, for example, he would have the path HMDB persons Brad Pitt in XP, while on the Next.js server, the way we have set it up, you would access him by typing persons / Brad Pitt in the URL. And what we're seeing here currently, this sample preview that you're seeing, that is just, this is the HMDB, as we call it, the Headless movie database. It's our standard setup. So we have our standard rendering, which is built into that. Where does that come from? It comes from this line in site XML in the XP app. So what this says is just any content type that doesn't start with media, so we don't render images, it excludes media. but any other content type we will render with preview.js, and so that's what we're seeing here. Moving on to the actual Next.js side. Here we have sort of a raw front end running, and this is a kind of a data dump default view that I've just put in for this presentation. So it just demonstrates that XP is hooked up on the back end. So it will fetch the data for the item that you point to with a URL and render that with a setup that I'm going to show you. It also has, if the URL does not match anything, you get a 404. So that's what happens when it doesn't match any content item on the back end. Let's see. Going into the Next.js code here, what we have is it all starts with this -- content path, and that's some Next.js magic file name to get it to fetch the URL path into content path, as we see here. So what this server-side rendering routine does, it calls fetch content, which is part of the starter we're going to release, and it asks that to run a query against Guillotine and gets back content, metadata, errors if anything happens, and page builder data, which we're also going to show you. And it sends that as props in the standard Next.js way into the Next.js flow. All of this uses the _app. For the sake of this demonstration, I've just been wrapping it in a layout, so everything looks good. That's the header and the footer you see here. But beyond that, we're just sending everything straight down the pipeline. And via some things, we're going to end up here, which is the default view, which does the actual rendering. So this is the data dump component that you can see. Also, I want to show you this query here. It's called get default data, and that's the query that runs by default if nothing else is set up. So whenever content path runs fetch content will check, do we have any specialized queries? If not, it's going to run this query, which in turn gives us the standard data to play with. So far, this is all just headless rendering. So let's see if we can get this rendering into the preview in the XP side. So I'm going to check out the, let's see, this one here. And while I explain what's going on, I'll just start a build. So that can go in the background. Okay, the change that's been done here is that there's no longer this preview.js. Now we have the proxy.js. And it has two mappings. The first of them is to just take over all the types the way we seen earlier. And there's also this one, which is necessary. Where does proxy.js come from? It's simply released as a library. So you add it the way you would in any XP project in build.gradle. lib frontend proxy provides the proxy.js. Let's see. I can also mention, for those of you who haven't checked it out, this mapping here is part of the HMDB, but you can do it in any Next project. It makes it so that you get we call it the GraphQL playground, with kind of a REPL to just play around with queries and just see whatever you get from the queries. It's kind of a handy tool.
I guess
I'm not going to go more into that. You got a comment, Thomas?
Yeah, I guess you meant any XP project.
Yeah, of course. Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry. Okay. We have the build going through, so now we should get something a little bit different on the front end. Here, what we see is that we activate proxy from the lib on each content, and it will just contact the next server like this. So the preview, of course, XP here and XP here is the same XP instance. It's just here we have the Content Studio preview, contacts the proxy, uses that to just invoke the next rendering the exact same way. So let's customize the front end a little bit more. I'm going to check out the branch where that's done. So this data that we got from the standard dump is kind of somewhat useful, but not really. So first of all, what we have here is some customized code on the next side for each of the content types. So list corresponds to folder. We have a get movie and get person. So all of these have got their own specialized queries for Guillotine, which performs different things. And one thing is that this is more efficient, but another advantage with making these custom queries is that you can make deeper queries, not only about the item that you're currently looking at. For example, here, whenever we're looking at a movie, we also get the cast, which is a list of persons referred to by that movie. And we get their images and links to them by name and so on, which is useful. In the content selector here, which is where we connect things by content type to the actual stuff going on. It's just an object. We take the string name of the content type from XP and use as a key. We add a query parameter and the string that we got. This is simply routing up like this. So what we get then, same old boring rendering, but much more useful data at this moment. For example, here we get an image URL and so on. So now that we have some better data, we can hook this up as props to actual components in React. So I've written those as well. We have a simple list for the folders, which will just turn each folder into a list of clickable links. Movies are an image with movie items, movie images, I mean, and the cast rendered out, and the person is just an image with a little bit of info. So if I go back to the content selector and I uncomment this, so I activate the view for each of them. This is just those React components imported. And as soon as this is built, it's dev mode, so that happens fast. We get the immediate result in XP. So we see that each of these content types have their own particular way of rendering it, now that everything's hooked up the way we want. Okay, so far we've been rendering items of different types differently, but we haven't really started using the power of XP's page builder, which gives us drag and drop capabilities and the possibility to make different content items uniquely set up for each other. So let's try to do that. I'll check out that in Git. Sorry, just a second. Starting the rebuild. So the difference now is two main things on the next side. First of all, I've added base to the exclusion. We don't want content items that start with base to be rendered directly with the proxy. And the reason for that is we're going to customize the folders. Folder type names are called base folders. So here we have excluded the folders effectively. The second difference is that now we have a page controller which is called front-end rendered, which contains one region, and the JS controller of that page controller, in addition to just adding a header just to signal that this is the rendering mode right now, it only asks the proxy to do the rendering. So the flow is the same, with the difference that it's the page controller that does it, and the page controller adds a region that we can drop things into. Also, we have this part called person list, and that gives us an overridable heading, which is pretty much not important, but just to demonstrate the possibility. And also, it simply invokes the proxy to do the rendering. Let's see here. If we go into persons, for example, and edit that now, now we, instead of seeing the standard rendering based on type, we get the standard XP rendering. So we choose the page controller, which should render us, whoops. Something was hanging back there, I think. Okay, I'm having a little bit of a hiccup. Just let me check for a moment what's going on here. Oh, right. As easy as that. I just hadn't checked out the right thing on the next slide. So let's do that. I'll just return this, and we will go over here. And this gives us what we want. Now it's all still activated in the content selector, but our default view now only renders a region. And that takes care of everything we might want to drop into the page builder. So let's just refresh this. Here we go. Now we see the region rendered. And so just to underline what you just saw here, it's all the time Next doing the rendering here. And yet we get the full XP capabilities. So I'm going to drop the person list into this. It looks exactly the same because I've moved the rendering from the list component and over to a part component that I've called person list, which just does the exact same thing. But in addition, we have the part selector. So this works the way that the same way as the content type selector. This is the string name of the part from XP, and the boilerplate recognizes that and renders it with the person list part, which looks the same. So now we can, for example, override the heading. We can write whatever we want, and everything will, of course, be, this is what is rendered on the front end. We can check that out here. So now I'm looking directly at the Next.js rendering, fetching the data from the XP front end and getting the rendering that we've defined. So there it is. To summarize, the boilerplate sets this up for you to get easily started. As soon as you've just configured the two servers to talk to each other like this, you can use the selectors, content selector, part selector. Maybe we'll add more along the same way of thinking. But the point is to guide the data queries and the React component rendering. And then you just match the URL to the content path. And for getting a preview to work in Content Studio, you only need to add the proxy from the library and just hook that up with a mapping in Site XML, the way we see it.
Espen,
yes.
Maybe you could just tell people how many sort of Next servers do you need to run, or how is that set up? Do you need,
that's
one? Do you need
that's
one
an
for
interesting
preview?
question. The idea here is that when you set this up with the config, you configure the Next server to point to one XP instance and one root site element and one branch. So that means that if you want to run, if you want to see the master branch and the draft branch, they will need each their own Next.js server running. And for that reason, the way the config is set up is we're using these env variables. And the way we just set it up here for starters is we have a development mode, which will be triggered when we run npx next dev, and that will contact our draft server. But at the same time, if we start the production mode, we start a different server on a different port, which will contact master node. So it's perfectly possible to have two Next.js servers running at the same time, one handling each branch in XP, and so you get parallel rendering.
Yeah, so not just possible. I guess you will need a separate server for the preview and a separate server to deliver.
And that's an architectural choice, because you probably, it's more important to have some permission differences between who's going to be able to render directly from the master and from the branch node. I mean.
Yeah, and I guess if you have like two sites, you then have to run two front ends to deliver and two preview servers right now at least.
Right now at least, but we'll of course look into ways to simplify that, possibly, if we can come up with something.
Yeah.
Let's see. There are some questions here.
Thank you, Espen. Yeah, we do have a couple of questions.
Should I take them now, or are we waiting?
Yeah, you can just read them.
Okay. The backend code of the Enonic app. At the moment, this is what I've been using is simply the standard HMDB app. You can get that on the market, but also the proxy is the thing we will release separately from this. So the idea is to be able to plug the proxy into any project. So when we release that, that can be used. I guess they are public repos right now, so you can always go to GitHub and find them. But it's a working project currently, so I recommend waiting until we have it published. Second question: do you always query all possible parts and components? Can sometimes you don't know what a page will contain, right? Of course, and one way to handle that is to add the first data dump that I made. So you can make a default view which just dumps the data onto the screen. And so if you haven't hooked anything up, you can see exactly what props you get to work with, including the names of the page structure that you have to work with. I hope that answers.
Espen, I don't think that's what he's asking. I think he's asking if you have like maybe if you have the person list component. He's asking, would you query for all the components in every request, basically?
That's the base mode of doing it. That's the default way of querying it. Of course, you can override that using the selectors.
Yeah. So, but this will be documented in the when we release it. So you'll give you examples on how you can do things. So because you might do fine with the basic config for a page, but sometimes you need to do more queries.
Yeah.
And the default approach is to do this. But of course, if you have like 1,000 components, you might want to reconsider how you do this and implement something that's a bit more, I don't know, granular.
But, and not to mention effective.
But generally, this is the fast way of doing it, because you can then do one query. It will only return data from the components on that specific page, even though the query might be sort of semi-big. That will kind of be outweighed by the reduced number of requests. So since we're running this on separate servers, you have to pay attention to reduce number of requests basically due to latency.
Yes, but the basic idea is to have things easily customizable, and we're kind of leaving it in your hands what kind of data you'll be asking for if you're going outside of the default behavior. Third question is...
Last question. Yeah, the last question.
There's a little bit of lag here. Is lib frontend proxy agnostic when it comes to front-end technology? I would say basically yes to that. Two things that are required then. The first thing is that it needs to be a server-side rendering for things to work absolutely right, at least currently. And secondly, the proxy performs a little bit of massaging of the output and adapts it a little bit so that it will work in the preview. And that means there are certain, let's say, I'm going to add in the guide a checklist for how the output from the front end would need to look like and act in order for it to work on the proxy. And then you would be able to use it with anything.
Yeah.
And an interesting idea for the future, I guess, is that the fetch content should also basically, at least conceptually, be front-end agnostic. So we might release a version of that at some point that will be possible to use with any kind of front-end. But that's a little bit looking ahead.
More questions incoming?
Yeah, sure. Let's see, just to verify, for one website, we would need 3 servers, a Next.js server and two Enonic server. I would say the other way around. It's 2 Next.js servers and 1 Enonic server, because XP will handle both the data handling and the preview in Content Studio, but you would need 1 Next server for the master branch and 1 for the draft branch. That's at least the setup I would recommend.
We might also add that this is, of course, when you're doing this, you want to run your own front end, you will end up running and managing more server instances and different things than versus using Enonic directly, of course. So for anyone looking to use React on XP, the alternative to Next.js is using our React for XP library, which kind of provides much of the same functionality, but than running on the XP framework rather than React. Oh, sorry, Next. Final question there.
Yeah. Final question. For the preview round trip, how does authentication work to only let the user see the content they are allowed to see? That's also a very important question. I would say basically we're leaving that to the developers to consider, but one way to solve it could be architecturally to let only the master branch be exposed outwards and keep the draft branch in a separate environment. There are many ways to solve that.
Yeah, we haven't dived into that too much.
No.
So currently, most headless projects are likely to use public content, I guess, and in that case, it's not that complex for you because all the content will be readable. You just need to worry about who can access that preview server. So with our setup, you can actually hide it behind firewalls and whatever. So the preview server doesn't have to be accessible for others. And of course, the other server will only answer to published items, right? So
exactly.
If you wanna deal with, like, say, highly granular items, you have to pass some token and make sure that the front end server sort of gets the same user that's working, or at least some way authenticates towards the GraphQL API with the same user. I know Tomaril here has been playing around with that and forwarding some session IDs and stuff. So so that might possibly be one way of doing it.
Yeah, thank you, Espen. I can also mention that Espen is in parallel with the starter itself, is working on a new guide, which will contain lots of code samples and hopefully answer all of the questions that you might get after today's session. And we're going to publish it together with the release.
Of course.
When it's out.